But then there is also a kind of ideological justification. I've seen many socialists debating the fact that actually the starvation of the kulaks was kind of their fault for not cooperating with mass collectivization. It's like, okay, so
Wow.
that's a very interesting blaming the victim sort of
Heck of
perspective.
a take, yeah.
But then I think there's something more to it that underlies the whole thing. I think this is the problem with left wing Enlightenment politics generally, that is a kind of presupposition that like good politics can be presupposed before we interact with reality, right? So this is what we could call political correctness. That the idea that underpins that is that there is a correct politics.
Hmm.
But the thing is, that doesn't really make very much sense, because if politics is the management of power in society, which I think is a fair description of what it is, and that's why we care about things like representative democracy, because we want power to be imbued into people we've elected that we can remove at whenever we want, and to be representative of the interests of the people, then what you're talking about is something that is necessarily in the world. You know, it's something that is physical. I need to look at them, I need to look at them, I need to look at them, and we need to decide how this is all going to be managed. So I can't, before looking at anything, decide already what the correct politics is. I can't just sit there in my room and just dream up the correct politics, come to the political arena and then be like, well, it's nothing like I said it should be. It's like, well, who the hell are you? Why would
Yeah.
your opinion matter? You know, like, why would you think that you could, in abstract, plan out the correct politics and then blame the world for not being as you expected it to be? It
Hmm.
doesn't really make any sense. But I think that's what the communists have actually done. They've assumed that actually a world like John Lennon's Imagine, where wouldn't it be nice if we all just had, you know, open borders, we didn't have any property, and everyone was happy and healthy and they weren't starving for, you know, various reasons. Wouldn't that be nice? It's like, I mean, maybe, but is that going to happen? And
Yes.
does that happen from communism? And the answer is no, it doesn't happen. You get the complete opposite, where millions of people die through starvation and wars, and the societies themselves are tyrannized, and they try to change the nature of what it is to be a human into being Marx's new man, you know,
Hmm.
and things like this, the new Soviet man. And it all turns into a giant Orwellian dystopia that's horrible. And then when you get to that point, it's like, yeah, but that's not what I had in mind. It's like, okay, I'm
There's
sure
no way
that
with that.
wasn't. I'm
Yeah.
sure that wasn't what you had in mind. But unfortunately, reality doesn't really care what you have in mind. It cares
Yeah.
about what's actually happening. And so I think the very notion of political correctness is a falsehood. I don't think there is a correct politics.
Hmm.
And I think that's the thing that allows the socialists to just duck around the catastrophe and let that fade into the distance as if it's nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
Maybe.
It's really interesting that every time people strive to create a utopia, inevitably, every single time, every single place,
Yeah.
it ends up with a dystopian nightmare. And I think there are two types of people in the world. And, well, there's more than two types of people in the world. But I think that there is an interesting dichotomy that I've observed, which I think typically sort of falls into what people do refer to as the left and right spectrum for the most part. And I feel like those who tend to lean right are more, I'm generalizing a little bit here, but tend to compare things to history and reality and other places in the world. They tend to compare to reality rather than comparing to an imaginary utopian vision, right? So
Yes.
take for an example, if you ask someone who's more right leaning, more conservative, is is the UK a racist country or is the USA a racist country? Typically, they're going to lean towards saying no. Or if they ask a follow up question, they'll say, well, compared to what, right? Are you compared to history? Absolutely not. Compared to other countries in the world, assuming you've traveled a little bit, absolutely not, right? If you've traveled and you know history, you'll know that we live in one of the least racist countries in the entire world at the least racist time period in history ever, right? So by that, I would say, no, the UK is not a racist country. Whereas if you ask someone who's more left leaning, and I think the further left you go, the more likely they are to say yes. And then they will compare it to Unicornia, where there is no racism at all, and there is no sexism at all, and everyone can identify as what they want, and there's no discrimination, and minimum wage is $50 an hour, and everything is perfect, et cetera. So it leads to like a really different interpretation of reality where two people can both be living in the same country and experiencing the same thing. Like, I can talk to some black people I know, and they're convinced that the UK is very racist and that at every level, every structure, etc. And I'm like, sometimes I'm like, do we live in the same country? And I've traveled the UK more than you have, and I've spoken to more people in the UK more than you have. Like, if someone was going to experience a lot of racism in this country, I mean, I've been everywhere from Isle of Wight to Glasgow, Swansea to Norwich. I've spoken to hundreds of thousands of British people. I'm like, man, if these people are raging racists, they're not doing it very well. Like they're not doing it very well. And then also I'm like, well, again, so what are you comparing to? Like, what other countries have you been to? Last year in China, they were banning black people from McDonald's and shopping centers because they were claiming that Africans spread coronavirus. Like, can you even imagine something like that happening in the UK?
Impossible. It would be, and rightly so. Don't get me wrong. I'm not complaining that would be impossible. But it rightly so impossible, because that's just not the way that we want to operate our society. We're not collectivist. We're individualist, and that's to our credit. But I find it really interesting you say about utopias, because the term utopia was meant to be a derogatory sort of joke almost. What are you doing? You're trying to find a perfect world, and then they're like, yeah, that's a great idea. It's like, no, it's not a great idea. But it is a really interesting point that you make about the conservatives, and the idea of a conservative utopia is always in the past, isn't it? So the conservatives have rose-tinted glasses for that which was, and so they want to not radically change things because you're trying to preserve, surely. I mean, I'm not a conservative myself, but this is what I understand from their position. They're trying to preserve that which is, right? And because it's inherited from that which was. And so you don't want to get rid of that, because that's the thing that's precious to you. Whereas the left wing has the opposite opinion, which was that which was is worse. Really bad, and in some ways it was worse. And in some ways maybe not. But they've got in the future this ideal point that they think they'll get to, which is deeply ironic. Because as you said, no one will suffer racism or sexism or transphobia. But then if you actually look at left-wing discussions around these ideas, you realize, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. You realize there's no consensus here at all.
I do not scam. Put some respect on my name. Sick like a